I'm Marcus Sterling, 47, and I thought I had everything under control. 23 years of marriage, 2 kids in college, a modest suburban home that Helen loved. She handed me the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, her hands trembling as she whispered about feeling like strangers. The irony cut deep. She was leaving me because she thought we were struggling financially, that I'd failed as a provider. But Helen had no idea about the $500 million sitting in accounts across 3 continents. Money I'd earned through a series of calculated investments and business deals I'd kept hidden, thinking I was protecting our family. The morning she filed for divorce, I was already planning to surprise her with the truth. Instead, I watched the woman I loved walk away, believing I was worth nothing. What happened next would shatter both our worlds in ways neither of us saw coming. The family photo from last Christmas sits on my desk now, mocking me with its false happiness. Helen's smile reaches her eyes in that picture, something I haven't seen in months. Sarah and David flank us, home from college, all of us wearing the matching red sweaters Helen insisted on buying from Target's clearance rack. We can't afford the full-price ones, she'd said, and I'd nodded along, playing the role of the struggling provider while my phone buzzed with notifications about another 7-figure gain in my portfolio. 23 years of marriage, built on a foundation I'd thought was love, but now I realize was constructed from my lies. Helen met me when I was genuinely broke, a failed entrepreneur with big dreams and empty pockets. She was teaching elementary school then, making $28,000 a year, and she paid for our first apartment deposit because I couldn't scrape together the money. We're a team, she'd said, and I believed it. I loved her fierce loyalty, the way she'd eat ramen for weeks so I could afford business cards for whatever harebrained scheme I was chasing. She never made me feel small, even when I was failing. At everything I touched. The irony burns now. When I finally succeeded, really succeeded, I couldn't tell her. By then, the pattern was set. She was used to our careful budgeting, our modest life, our shared struggle. How could I explain that I'd been lying for years? That while she clipped coupons and drove her Honda until it literally wouldn't start, I was watching millions accumulate in accounts she didn't know existed. Last Christmas, she apologized for the generic brand sparkling cider instead of champagne. I wanted to tell her we could buy the entire winery if she wanted. Instead, I kissed her forehead and told her it was perfect. The photograph captures everything wrong with our marriage: Helen's genuine contentment with so little, my forced smile hiding so much. She believed in our simple life because she thought it was real. I let her believe it because I was too afraid to admit I'd been living a double life for over a decade now. Staring at those divorce papers, I understand that my protection became her prison. Every sacrifice she made was unnecessary. Every worry about money was my fault. I thought I was shielding her from the stress of wealth, but I was really just protecting myself from the consequences of my deception. The worst part? She was happy. Helen was genuinely happy in our modest life, proud of how we'd built something together from nothing. She didn't need the money to love me. She proved that every day for 23 years. But I was too scared to trust in that love, too afraid that revealing the truth would somehow diminish what we had. The divorce papers feel heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that I've lost the most precious thing I ever had, not through poverty, but through the wealth I thought would protect us. Asterisk, asterisk. The Swiss bank statement arrived in 2018, showing my first $50 million milestone. I remember staring at those numbers, printed in that sterile Helvetica font, feeling simultaneously triumphant and terrified. The document sat in my locked desk drawer for weeks before I could even process what it meant. It started innocently enough in 2009. I'd made a small bet on a struggling tech startup called CloudSync, $50,000, that Helen thought went toward another failed business venture. She rolled her eyes when I told her about it, the same patient expression she'd worn through a dozen other opportunities that had gone nowhere. Just promise me we won't lose the house, she'd said, and I'd kissed her cheek, assuring her it was money we could afford to lose. Except CloudSync didn't fail. Amazon acquired them 18 months later for $2.8 billion. My tiny stake became $4.2 million overnight. I should have told Helen immediately. Should have celebrated, paid off the mortgage, taken that trip to Italy she'd always dreamed about. Instead, I panicked. The money felt too big, too unreal. What if there were tax implications I didn't understand? What if something went wrong? I opened the Swiss account telling myself it was temporary, just until I figured out how to handle this windfall responsibly. I'd surprise Helen once I had a proper plan. The second windfall came in 2012. I'd quietly invested that first $4.2 million in a portfolio of emerging tech companies. When Pinterest went public, then Twitter, then a dozen smaller exits, the numbers multiplied beyond my wildest projections. By 2015, I was looking at $47 million spread across 3 different offshore accounts. The psychological weight of the secret grew heavier with each passing year. I'd lie awake at night, Helen sleeping peacefully beside me, calculating how much interest we'd earned that day while she worried about the electric bill. The guilt was crushing, but so was the fear of confession. How do you tell your wife you've been lying for 6 years? How do you explain that every budget meeting, every discussion about whether we could afford new appliances, Every stress about the kids' college funds, all of it was theater. The irony became unbearable. Helen would spend hours researching the cheapest grocery stores, clipping coupons, buying generic brands. She'd patch holes in our jeans instead of buying new ones. She'd skip her book club dinner because we couldn't afford the $30 expense. Meanwhile, I was earning more in daily interest than she made in a month teaching. The third major windfall pushed me over the edge. In 2019, I'd invested heavily in a biotechnology firm developing COVID treatments. When the pandemic hit and their stock price skyrocketed, my portfolio exploded to $150 million. By 2021, with careful reinvestment and a few more lucky breaks, I was looking at $300 million. The money had its own momentum now. I'd created a monster that grew faster than I could control it. Every month brought new statements, new milestones, new reasons to keep the secret just a little longer. I told myself I was protecting Helen from the stress of wealth. Rich people had different problems: security concerns, family members asking for money, the pressure of managing large sums. Our simple life was peaceful. Why complicate it? But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was protecting myself. I was terrified that revealing the money would somehow change Helen's love for me, that she'd wonder if I'd been testing her all these years, that she'd never trust me again. The secret had become my prison. Asterisk, asterisk, Helen's resignation letter from Jefferson Elementary sits in my briefcase now, another artifact of my failures. She'd taught fourth grade there for 15 years, loved those kids like they were her own. But last spring, when the school district announced budget cuts and layoffs, Helen made the decision that broke my heart. "I'll resign," she told me over dinner, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "Let someone younger keep their job. We can make it work on your consulting income." My consulting income, the modest $85,000 a year I claimed to make from freelance technology consulting, a carefully constructed lie that explained my flexible schedule and occasional business trips to manage my investments. While Helen was sacrificing her career, I was earning more in a week than she made in a year. "Helen, you don't have to do that," I said, but the words felt hollow. How could I argue without revealing the truth? "The younger teachers have families to support," she insisted. "And honestly, Marcus, we need to start thinking about retirement. If I keep working, I'll get too comfortable. This forces us to be more careful with money." More careful with money? I watched her write that resignation letter, her teacher's careful handwriting spelling out the end of a career she loved, and I felt like a monster. She was giving up her purpose, her daily joy, her identity, all to help a budget that was completely fabricated. The signs had been building for months. Helen had started buying the cheapest possible groceries, switched to generic everything, began darning socks instead of buying new ones. She'd canceled her gym membership, stopped getting her hair done professionally, started cutting coupons from newspapers she'd begun subscribing to specifically for the deals. Asterisk, every little bit helps, she'd say, proud of saving $13 on a grocery bill while I checked my phone to see that my portfolio had gained $130,000 that day. She'd always been frugal, but this was different. This was desperation wearing the mask of virtue. Helen wasn't just saving money, she was punishing herself for expenses she thought we couldn't afford. I watched her choose the smallest coffee size at Starbucks, watched her put back items at the grocery store, watched her research generic brands like she was preparing for a doctoral thesis. The woman who'd once splurged on good wine for special occasions now bought boxed wine and called it perfectly adequate. The breaking point came 3 months before the divorce papers. Helen had been looking at our bank statements, the fake ones I'd created to show our modest checking and savings accounts. And she started crying. "I feel like such a failure," she whispered. 23 years of marriage, and we barely have anything saved for retirement. I should have pushed you harder to take that corporate job. I should have worked more hours, taken on tutoring." I held her while she cried, feeling her body shake with sobs that were entirely my fault. She was blaming herself for our financial situation, a situation that existed only in my lies. "You're not a failure," I said. But she couldn't hear me over her own guilt. That night, I lay awake planning to tell her everything. I'd imagined the conversation 1,000 times, but I could never figure out how to start. How do you confess? To a lie that's grown so large it's consumed your entire marriage. By morning, my courage had vanished again. I told myself I needed more time to plan, needed to figure out the legal implications, needed to prepare for every possible reaction. But Helen was already disappearing before my eyes, shrinking into someone I barely recognized, someone who apologized for every small expense, who second-guessed every purchase, who'd convinced herself that she was the reason for our struggles. The woman who'd once believed we could conquer the world together, now believed she was holding us back. Asterisk, asterisk, the handwritten letter sits in my desk drawer. Never sent, never seen by Helen. I'd written it the night before she served me with divorce papers, finally ready to tell her everything. 3 pages of careful explanation, apologies, and promises, all rendered meaningless by timing. "Dear Helen," it begins, "I have something to tell you that should have been said years ago. I love you more than life itself, and that love has driven me to make terrible choices. I was planning to give it to her that morning over coffee, our usual ritual before she left for her volunteer work at the food bank. I'd imagined the conversation, rehearsed the words, prepared for every possible reaction. Finally, after all these years, I was ready to trust her with the truth. Instead, I woke up to Helen standing by the kitchen counter, her hands shaking as she held a manila envelope. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I filed for divorce." The words didn't make sense at first. Divorce? We'd been having problems. Sure, but divorce? I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying while my confession burned in my pocket. "Helen, what are you talking about? We can work through whatever." "No, we can't." She handed me the envelope, and I could see she'd been crying. "I've been dying slowly in this marriage. Marcus, every day I wake up feeling like I'm not enough, like I'm dragging you down, like I'm the reason we're always struggling." I opened the envelope with trembling hands, the legal documents making everything real, irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution of assets, the end of everything that mattered to me. "The kids are adults now," Helen continued, her voice growing stronger. "They don't need us to stay together for them. And I can't keep pretending that I'm happy living paycheck to paycheck, watching you stress about money all the time." She thought I was stressed about money. Helen was leaving me because she believed I was worried about our finances, when the truth was, I lost sleep over how to tell her about the hundreds of millions sitting in accounts she didn't know existed. "Helen, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain." She was crying now, but there was resolve in her voice. "I love you, Marcus. I've loved you for 23 years. But I can't love you enough to make up for how much I've started to hate myself." The knife twisted deeper. She hated herself because of my lies. "I need you to know this isn't about you," she continued. "You're a good man who's worked hard and tried your best. But I can't keep being the wife who holds you back, who makes you choose between your dreams and our bills." I stood there holding the divorce papers, my confession letter, a dead weight in my pocket, watching the love of my life walk away because she thought she was saving me from herself. "I'll stay at my sister's tonight," she said, picking up a bag she'd already packed. "We can figure out the details later." After she left, I sat at our kitchen table for hours, staring at the letter I'd never given her. 3 pages of truth. Too late to matter. Asterisk. The private investigator's report landed on Helen's attorney's desk 3 weeks after she filed for divorce. I know this because James Mitchell, Helen's lawyer, called me personally, a courtesy that felt more like a threat. "Mr. Sterling, we need to talk." His voice was carefully neutral. "My client hired a forensic accountant to review your financial situation for the divorce proceedings. There appear to be some discrepancies. Discrepancies. Such a polite word for the bomb that was about to detonate my carefully constructed life. I'd been naive to think Helen would simply accept the modest assets I'd declared our house. 2 cars, and the $47,000 in checking and savings accounts I'd carefully maintained as our visible money. Helen was methodical by nature, a teacher who checked and double-checked everything. Of course she'd want a complete picture before dividing our assets. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vance, had started with simple things: bank records, credit reports, tax returns, but she'd noticed inconsistencies that my carefully managed facade couldn't hide. My lifestyle didn't match my declared income. Small things but telling. The expensive watch I'd claimed was a gift, the high-end laptop I supposedly bought used, the first-class airline tickets for business, trips that my modest consulting income couldn't support. "There are international wire transfers, Mr. Sterling," Mitchell continued. "Transfers to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. Would you care to explain these?" My mouth went dry. I'd been so careful about the big picture that I'd missed the digital breadcrumbs. Every wire transfer, every international transaction, every movement of money left traces that a professional investigator could follow. "I need to call my attorney," I managed. "I think that would be wise," Mitchell replied. "We'll need full disclosure of all assets, both domestic and foreign, within 30 days. I trust you understand the legal implications of concealing assets." During divorce proceedings, after hanging up, I sat in my office with my hands shaking, finally understanding that my secret was no longer secret. The walls I'd built around my double life were crumbling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I called David Brennan, the attorney who'd helped me set up the offshore accounts years ago. He listened to my situation with the grim professionalism of someone who'd seen this before. "Marcus, you're in serious trouble," he said bluntly. "We're not just talking about divorce anymore. If you've been hiding assets of this magnitude while claiming financial hardship, there could be criminal charges, tax evasion, fraud, perjury if you've signed any documents under oath." The next few days became a blur of emergency meetings, legal consultations, and desperate damage control. I had to hire a criminal defense attorney alongside my divorce lawyer. The forensic accountant was peeling back years of carefully constructed lies, following money trails I'd thought were untraceable. Patricia Vance was thorough and relentless. She'd found the shell companies I'd used, traced the investment accounts, mapped out a web of financial deception that spanned over a decade. Every clever move I'd made to hide my wealth was being systematically exposed. The worst part was knowing that Helen was learning the truth from strangers, cold legal professionals who saw our marriage as nothing more than a case to solve. She wasn't hearing my carefully planned explanations or heartfelt apologies. She was reading clinical reports that made me sound like a calculating fraud, and maybe that's exactly what I was. Asterisk, asterisk, Sarah's phone call came at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Just as I was reviewing the latest legal documents from my attorney, her voice was tight with stress, the same tone she'd used as a child when she was trying not to cry. "Dad, I'm really worried about the tuition payment for next semester," she said. "I know Mom and you are going through stuff right now, but my financial aid got cut, and I need another $8,000 by the deadline." I stared at the pile of college tuition bills on my desk. Sarah's from Northwestern, David's from Cornell, two kids drowning in student loan debt while their father sat on $500 million. The bills were reminders of every conversation, where Helen and I had told them we were doing our best, but they'd need to take out loans for their education. "Honey, don't worry about it," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized how impossible they'd become. How could I suddenly produce $8,000 without raising questions? How could I explain that money wasn't a problem when their entire lives had been shaped by our supposed financial limitations? "I don't want to stress you out more," Sarah continued, "but I'm working 25 hours a week on top of classes just to cover my living expenses. Jenny's parents bought her a car last week, and here I am eating ramen every night and walking 2 miles to campus because I can't afford parking." Each word was a knife. Sarah was my brilliant, hardworking daughter who deserved every advantage in the world. She'd earned a full academic scholarship to Northwestern, but still needed loans for room and board, books, and living expenses. She worked nights at a campus coffee shop, studied until 2 a.m., and never complained about the sacrifices, while I accumulated more money in a day than she'd earn in a year. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here, sweetheart. We'll figure something out." "No, you will. You always do." The trust in her voice was devastating. "I just feel bad adding to your stress when you and Mom are dealing with so much." After hanging up, I called David at Cornell. He answered on the first ring, probably hoping for good news about the divorce. "Hey Dad, how are you holding up?" David had always been more intuitive than Sarah, better at reading between the lines. At 20, he carried himself with a maturity that made me proud and guilty in equal measure. Asterisk, "I'm managing," I said. "How are classes going?" "Good, but honestly, Dad, I'm worried about you. You sound different lately. And this thing with Mom, I know you guys think you're protecting us, but we can tell something major is happening." I wanted to tell him everything. David would understand the complexity better than Sarah, might even help me figure out how to rebuild the family relationships. "But how do you explain to your son that every sacrifice he's made, every loan he's taken, every night he's worked instead of studying or socializing, was completely unnecessary?" "Your mom and I are working through some issues," I said carefully, "but neither of you need to worry about money for school. We'll handle it." "That's what you always say." "But Dad, I see the stress. I know you're working extra hours to pay for our education. Sometimes I think we should have gone to state schools. Saved you the burden." "The burden." My son thought his Ivy League education was a burden on his father, who was secretly one of the wealthiest men in the state. "You kids are the best investment I ever made," I said, and meant it completely. But as I hung up, I realized that was exactly the problem. They should never have been investments at all. Asterisk, asterisk. The Cayman Islands account summary arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by messenger to Helen's sister's house where she'd been staying. James Mitchell had called ahead to prepare her, but nothing could have made this revelation easier to absorb. I wasn't there when she opened the envelope, but her sister Jenny told me later that Helen stared at the document for a full 10 minutes, without speaking. A single page showing an account balance of $127,346,892.33. In my name Alonge, which one of several accounts the investigators had uncovered. Helen called me at 2:17 p.m. I was in a meeting with my criminal defense attorney when my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. My hands were shaking as I answered. "Marcus?" Her voice was hollow, unfamiliar. "I need to see you now." We met at Riverside Park, the same place where I'd proposed 24 years ago. Helen was sitting on our old bench, the account summary folded neatly in her lap, staring out at the water. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what she'd learned. $127 million, she said without looking at me. "In one account? Just one." I sat down beside her, maintaining careful distance. "Helen, I can explain, can you?" She turned to face me, and I saw a stranger. The woman who'd loved me unconditionally for over 2 decades was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "Can you explain why you let me resign from a job I loved because we couldn't afford to live on one income? Can you explain why our children are drowning in student loan debt while you have more money than some small countries?" The questions I'd dreaded for years were finally here, and I had no good answers. "I was trying to protect you," I said, knowing how pathetic it sounded. "Protect me?" Helen's voice cracked. "Marcus, I've spent 15 years of our marriage feeling like a failure, feeling like I wasn't contributing enough, like I was the reason we struggled. I've apologized to you hundreds of times for expenses we couldn't afford, expenses that were drops in the bucket compared to what you have hidden away. She stood up, pacing now. The account summary crumpled in her fist. Do you know what I did? Last month, I returned a $30 sweater because I felt guilty spending money on myself. $30? Marcus? I felt selfish and irresponsible for wanting a sweater while you were earning my annual salary and interest every week. The accusations came faster now, each one deserved, each one devastating. I made Sarah take out loans for college because I thought we couldn't afford to help her more. I made David work nights at a grocery store to pay for textbooks. I've been clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores and feeling proud of saving money we didn't need to save. Helen, please. 23 years. Marcus, 23 years of marriage built on a lie. How long have you been hiding this? How long have you watched me sacrifice and struggle and worry about money that never mattered? I couldn't look at her. The first big windfall came in 2009. 14 years. The words came out as a whisper. 14 years of lies. She sat back down, but farther away from me now. The physical distance felt symbolic. She was already gone, even though she was still here. I need to understand something, she said, her voice eerily calm. Did you ever plan to tell me? Or were you going to let me live in this fake poverty forever? I thought about the letter in my desk, the confession I'd written the night before she served me with divorce papers. I was going to tell you, I said. The morning you gave me the divorce papers, I had a letter. A letter. Helen laughed, but there was no humor in it. You were going to tell me about $500 million in a letter. It wasn't $500 million then, I said desperately. It started small, and then it grew, and I kept thinking I'd tell you when the time was right, but there never seemed to be a right time. The time was right 14 years ago. Marcus, the time was right when I first started worrying about money. The time was right when I gave up my career. The time was right when our children started taking on debt for their education. She stood again, smoothing out the account summary with trembling hands. I don't know who you are, she said quietly. The man I married would never have done this. The man I loved would never have watched me suffer for his lies. As she walked away, I realized she was right. The man she'd married, the broke, optimistic dreamer, had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who chose fear over trust, deception over love, and I had no idea how to bring him back. Asterisk. My journal from 2001 sits open before me now. The pages yellowed with age, the handwriting that of a different man. I'd started keeping it during one of my failed business ventures, a habit Helen encouraged when I was struggling with the stress of constant rejection and financial uncertainty. March 15, 2001 reads, 1 entry. Helen paid the rent again this month. I see the worry in her eyes, but she never makes me feel like less of a man. She believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. I swear, when I finally make it, I'll give her everything she deserves. The early entries are full of hope and determination, chronicles of a young husband who genuinely believed that success was just around the corner. Helen appears in almost every page. Helen covering the utilities when my consulting check was late. Helen surprising me with my favorite dinner after a particularly brutal day of rejections. Helen holding me when I cried about feeling like a failure. June 8, 2003. Another entry reads, Helen found me crying over the bills tonight. Instead of lecturing me, she held my face in her hands and said, We're building something together, Marcus. It doesn't matter how long it takes. God, I love this woman. I promise myself I'll never forget how she stood by me during these dark times. But I did forget. Somewhere between the struggle and the success, I lost sight of the woman who'd loved me when I had nothing to offer except my dreams. Helen remembers things differently now. The conversation we had 3 days after she discovered the Cayman account revealed memories I'd somehow rewritten in my own mind. Where I remembered partnership, she remembered carrying the burden alone. Where I remembered shared struggle, she remembered her struggle and my empty promises. Do you remember when we couldn't afford to fix the washing machine? She asked, her voice steady but distant. 2004, I think. We had to take our clothes to the laundromat for 3 months because we couldn't scrape together $300 for repairs. I remembered. I also remembered that I'd just received a $50,000 consulting fee that I'd immediately reinvested instead of using to solve our immediate problems. I was so embarrassed, Helen continued, carrying laundry baskets on the bus, hoping none of my coworkers would see me. And you kept saying we'd fix it soon. We just needed to wait for your next payment. But your next payment never seemed to come, because I was already starting to hide money, already beginning to build the secret empire that would eventually trap us both. What about when Sarah needed glasses in 2nd grade? Helen's voice was getting quieter, more dangerous. We couldn't afford the frames she wanted, the pretty pink ones that all her friends had. She picked the cheapest ones instead, these ugly brown things that she hated. She never complained, but I saw how self-conscious she was. I closed my eyes. Sarah's glasses. I'd had $200,000 in a hidden investment account at the time, but I let my 8-year-old daughter wear glasses she hated because we supposedly couldn't afford the $40 upgrade. Or when David wanted to join Little League, but we couldn't afford the equipment and fees. He pretended he didn't care, but I caught him watching games at the park, standing behind the fence like he was on the outside of something he couldn't have. Each memory was a fresh wound. Helen wasn't just cataloging our struggles, she was showing me how my deception had stolen joy from our children's lives, how my fear of revealing the truth had created unnecessary poverty in the midst of my growing wealth. The worst part, Helen said, is that I was proud of us, proud of how we made do with so little, proud of how the kids learned to appreciate what they had. I thought we were teaching them values, gratitude, resourcefulness, the satisfaction of earning what you get, but it was all fake. They weren't learning life lessons. They were living my lies, because that's what they'd become, not my secret, not my hidden wealth, but my lies. Every time I'd agreed that money was tight, every time I'd nodded, along with budget discussions, every time I'd let Helen make sacrifices for a financial situation that didn't exist, I'd been lying. The compound effect of deception had created a reality where Helen genuinely believed she was married to a man who struggled to provide, where my children thought their father was doing his best but falling short, where every financial stress was met with resignation instead of solutions I could have easily provided. I'd become a stranger to my own family, playing a role I'd created to protect a secret that had grown larger than the life it was supposed to preserve. Looking at that 2001 journal entry now, I can see the exact moment I stopped being the man Helen fell in love with and became someone else, entirely someone who confused protection with deception, who mistook fear for wisdom, who lost everything real in pursuit of something that was never supposed to matter more than love. The amended divorce petition arrived like a death sentence, where the original filing had been a simple dissolution of marriage with modest asset division. The new document read like an indictment. James Mitchell had rewritten everything to reflect the true scope of my hidden wealth, and the numbers were staggering even to me. Total declared assets: $547,238,692. I sat in my attorney's office staring at the figure, realizing that even I hadn't known exactly how much I'd accumulated. The investigators had been more thorough than my own accountants, uncovering investments I'd nearly forgotten about, tracking compound growth across multiple currencies and markets. "Marcus, we need to discuss your exposure here," David Brennan said, his tone grave. "This isn't just about divorce anymore. The IRS has been notified of the offshore accounts. The state attorney general's office is reviewing the case for potential fraud charges, and there's a very real possibility of criminal prosecution for concealing assets." Criminal prosecution. The words hit me like ice water. I'd always thought of myself as someone who'd made poor personal choices, not as a criminal. But looking at the legal documents spread across the conference table, I understood that intent mattered less than impact. "What kind of charges are we talking about?" I asked. "Tax evasion, potentially. Fraud. If the prosecutor decides you've willfully misrepresented your financial situation in any legal documents. Perjury. If you've signed anything under oath claiming financial hardship. We're looking at possible federal charges, state charges, civil penalties that could exceed the hidden assets themselves." The media had started sniffing around too. A local business reporter had somehow caught wind of the case and published a small item about a significant undisclosed asset discovery in a local divorce proceeding. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots and my name became public. I thought about Helen reading about our marriage in the newspaper, about Sarah and David learning the full extent of their father's deception from strangers. On social media, the private shame was about to become public humiliation. "There's something else," Brennan continued. "Mrs. Sterling's attorney has requested a complete forensic audit of all your business dealings for the past 15 years. They want to establish a timeline of when the deception began and whether there are any other undisclosed assets or income streams. A forensic audit, every transaction, every investment, every wire transfer would be scrutinized by professionals whose job was to uncover financial secrets. The life I'd so carefully compartmentalized was about to be dissected in minute detail. They're also requesting punitive damages," Brennan added. "They're arguing that the emotional distress caused by your deception warrants additional compensation beyond the standard asset division." Punitive damages. Helen wasn't just leaving me, she was being advised to make me pay for the years of lies. Part of me thought I deserved it. Part of me was terrified about what it would mean for any chance of eventual reconciliation. "What are our options?" I asked. "Honestly, full disclosure and cooperation. We plead your case as a man who made terrible choices but not criminal ones. We emphasize that the money was never spent, never used to defraud anyone, never hidden for illegal purposes. We paint this as a psychological issue rather than a criminal one." A psychological issue. Maybe that was closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. Maybe the man who'd started hiding money in 2009, out of fear and uncertainty, had become someone else, entirely someone addicted to secrecy, paranoid about discovery. trapped in a web of deception that had grown beyond his control. "One more thing," Brennan said quietly. "The prosecutor's office has indicated they might be willing to consider a plea agreement if you cooperate fully and make substantial restitution to affected parties." Affected parties? Your wife? Your children? Potentially the tax authorities? The idea would be to make this right financially while avoiding criminal charges. Make it right. As if money could repair 23 years of broken trust. As if financial restitution could restore the love I'd lost through my own cowardice. But maybe it was the only path forward, not to redemption, but to accountability. Maybe facing the full consequences of my choices was the first step toward becoming someone worthy of the family I'd destroyed. **** Sarah's student loan documents lay scattered across my kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. She'd driven home from Northwestern the moment Helen told her about the hidden money, arriving at our house with a manila folder full of papers and a fury I'd never seen in my gentle daughter. $83,000, she said, her voice shaking. "That's what I owe in student loans. $83,000 for an education you could have paid for with pocket change." I'd never seen Sarah truly angry before, even as a child. She'd been the peacemaker, the one who mediated between David's intensity and our parental expectations. But the young woman standing in my kitchen was someone new, someone hardened by betrayal and armed with documentation of every sacrifice she'd made. "Sarah, let me explain." "Explain what, Dad?" "Explain how you watched me work 25-hour weeks at a coffee shop for 3 years. Explain how you let me eat ramen noodles for dinner 6 nights a week because I couldn't afford real food. Explain how you nodded sympathetically when I cried about being the only one in my dorm who couldn't afford to go home for spring break." She pulled out her laptop and opened a spreadsheet. Sarah had always been methodical, a trait she'd inherited from Helen. "I calculated it," she said, turning the screen toward me. "Every hour I worked instead of studying. Every social event I missed because I couldn't afford it. Every time I chose the generic brand or skipped buying textbooks new or walked 40 minutes to campus because I couldn't afford parking." The spreadsheet was devastating. Column after column of missed opportunities, quantified sacrifices, the cumulative cost of my deception measured not in dollars but in experiences my daughter would never get back. 2,347 hours. She read from the screen. "That's how much time I spent working jobs I didn't need. While you were sitting on $500 million, 2,000 hours I could have spent studying, or in clubs, or making friends, or just being a normal college student." I tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away. "Do you know what the worst part is? I was proud of myself. I thought I was learning responsibility, thought I was earning my education, thought I was proving I could make it on my own. And you were probably proud of me too, weren't you? Proud of your hardworking daughter who didn't ask for handouts?" The accusation hit home because it was true. I had been proud of Sarah's work ethic, her independence, her refusal to complain about her financial struggles. I'd watched her develop strength and resilience and told myself it was character building, never acknowledging that it was completely unnecessary. "I called David," she continued. "He's driving home from Cornell. He's even angrier than I am, if that's possible. At least I only have 3 semesters left. He's got 2 more years of this debt because of your lies." Sarah walked to the window, staring out at the modest backyard where she'd played as a child, where Helen had grown tomatoes in plastic containers because we supposedly couldn't afford proper planters. "Mom showed me the account statements," she said quietly. "The Cayman Islands one. You made more money in interest last month than I'll make in my first year out of college. Probably more than I'll make in my first 5 years. She turned back to face me, and I saw Helen in her expression, the same combination of disappointment and resolve that I'd been seeing for weeks. "I need you to understand something, Dad. This isn't just about the money. It's about every conversation we've had about my future, every decision I've made based on our supposed financial situation. Every time you've given me advice about being responsible with money when you were living the biggest financial lie imaginable." The truth of her words was inescapable. How many times had I lectured both kids about the value of hard work and financial responsibility while secretly living as one of the wealthiest men in the state? How many times had I nodded approvingly when they made frugal choices, never revealing that frugality was completely unnecessary? "I don't know who you are anymore," Sarah said, echoing her mother's words. "The dad I thought I knew would never have done this. The dad I respected would never have watched his children struggle for something he could have easily provided." As she gathered her papers to leave, Sarah paused at the door. "David and I talked about this. We don't want your money now. Even if you offered to pay off our loans, we wouldn't take it. We'd rather earn our degrees honestly than accept help from someone who's been lying to us our entire lives." The door closed behind her with finality, leaving me alone with the devastating realization that I'd lost not just my wife, but my children's respect perhaps forever. **** The IRS investigation notice arrived on a Friday, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official urgency that makes your stomach drop. I signed for it with trembling hands, already knowing that my carefully constructed financial house of cards was about to collapse completely. Notice of Federal Tax Investigation. The header read, followed by dense paragraphs of legal language that boiled down to a simple message. They knew everything, and I was in serious trouble. The government had been alerted by the divorce proceedings, as David Brennan had warned. When Helen's forensic accountant discovered the offshore accounts, they were legally obligated to report potential tax violations to federal authorities. The IRS moved fast when billions of dollars were involved. I called Brennan immediately, but he was already expecting my call. "Marcus, we need to meet immediately," he said. "The tax implications here are staggering. If the IRS determines you've been willfully evading taxes on offshore income, we're looking at criminal charges that could include substantial prison time. Prison time." The words felt surreal. I'd never even had a speeding ticket, and now I was facing potential federal criminal charges that could send me to jail for years. The investigation would be thorough and merciless. Every offshore account would be scrutinized, every investment, transaction reviewed, every wire transfer traced back to its source. The sophisticated legal structures I'd used to manage my wealth structures, that were perfectly legal when properly reported, became evidence of criminal intent when hidden. From tax authorities, the penalties alone could exceed your total assets, Brennan explained during our emergency meeting. Willful failure to report foreign accounts carries fines up to 50% of the account balance for each year of violation. We're talking about potential penalties in the hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions. I could lose everything I'd worked to build, and then some. The money I'd hidden to protect my family could result in debt that would destroy any hope of financial security for Helen or the children. But the tax implications were only the beginning. Helen's position as my spouse during the years of tax evasion created legal complications that kept me awake at night. Even though she'd been completely unaware of the hidden assets, her signature was on joint tax returns that failed to report offshore income. The government could argue that Helen should have known about the accounts, Brennan warned. Married couples are jointly liable for tax obligations, regardless of who actually earned the unreported income. The thought of Helen facing criminal charges because of my deception was unbearable. She could be charged as an accessory to tax evasion, could face fines and potential jail time for crimes she didn't even know were being committed. My lies hadn't just destroyed our marriage, they'd potentially destroyed her future. The irony was devastating. I'd hidden the money to protect Helen from the stress and complications of wealth, but my deception had exposed her to legal jeopardy far worse than anything she would have faced as a wealthy woman filing honest tax returns. "There's one option," Brennan said carefully. "The IRS has an offshore voluntary disclosure program. If we come forward voluntarily, provide complete information about all unreported accounts, and pay all back taxes plus penalties, they might agree not to pursue criminal charges." Voluntary disclosure. The government was offering me a chance to confess everything in exchange for avoiding prison. It would cost me most of my wealth back taxes, penalties, and legal fees would consume hundreds of millions, but it might protect Helen and preserve some assets for our children's future. "There's a catch," Brennan continued. "The disclosure has to be truly voluntary, since the divorce proceedings have already exposed the accounts. The IRS might argue that this is involuntary disclosure, but forced compliance that could void any protection from criminal prosecution. I was trapped by the timing of my own cowardice. If I'd come forward a year ago, before Helen filed for divorce, I might have had options. Now, with the accounts already exposed by divorce proceedings, I was entirely at the mercy of prosecutors who would decide whether to charge me with crimes that could send me to federal prison for decades. The investigation notice included a deadline for response: 30 days to provide complete documentation of all foreign assets and income, 30 days to compile 14 years of hidden financial records and present them to the same government I'd been deceiving since 2009. I thought about Helen, probably receiving her own notice, learning that her nightmare was just beginning. I thought about Sarah and David, whose college friends would soon read about their father's tax evasion in newspapers. I thought about the modest life we'd built together, now revealed as an elaborate fraud that could destroy us all. The price of my secrets wasn't just my marriage or my relationship with my children, it was potentially our freedom, our future, and any hope of rebuilding the trust I'd spent 14 years systematically destroying. ****. Helen's new bank account statement sits on her kitchen counter at Jenny's house, a simple document that represents something profound. The first time in 23 years that she's had money that's entirely her own. Not our money, not family money, but hers earned through the divorce settlement and managed according to her own judgment. Jenny told me about the transformation happening in her sister, how Helen was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under decades of financial anxiety and self-doubt. The woman who'd apologized for buying a $30 sweater was learning to make decisions without constantly calculating the cost against an imaginary budget. She bought a new car last week, Jenny told me during one of our awkward phone conversations. Nothing flashy, just a reliable Honda. But Marcus, you should have seen her face when she signed the papers. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She didn't agonize over the monthly payment. She just decided she needed reliable transportation and bought it. A car purchase as an act of liberation. It should have been pathetic, but instead it revealed how thoroughly my deception had diminished Helen's sense of agency. She'd spent so many years deferring financial decisions, accepting artificial limitations, that making an independent choice felt revolutionary. Helen had started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in financial trauma and family betrayal. The sessions were helping her understand that her relationship with money had been distorted by years of unnecessary scarcity, that her instincts for frugality and sacrifice had been weaponized against her own well-being. I keep catching myself apologizing for things, Helen told Jenny after one session. Last week I apologized to the grocery store clerk for buying name-brand cereal instead of generic. I literally said sorry for choosing Cheerios over store-brand Circles. Dr. Chen says, I've been conditioned to feel guilty about normal expenses. The therapy was uncovering layers of damage I'd never recognized. Helen's self-worth had become tied to her ability to stretch every dollar, to make sacrifices that demonstrated her value as a partner. My lies had taught her that her needs were secondary, that her desires were luxuries we couldn't afford, that her dreams were less important than our imaginary financial constraints. But the woman emerging from that damage was someone I barely recognized, stronger, more decisive, less willing to accept limitations imposed by others. Helen was discovering that she had opinions about money, about priorities, about the kind of life she wanted to live. She'd enrolled in a financial planning course at the community college, determined to understand investments and tax strategies, and asset management. The woman who'd never questioned my explanations about our tight budget was becoming someone who read financial statements with keen intelligence, who asked sharp questions about risk and return. I realized I gave up my financial literacy, along with my financial independence. She told Dr. Chen during a session I learned about through our attorneys. I let Marcus handle everything because I trusted him, but also because I was afraid of making mistakes. Now I see that not understanding money made me vulnerable to this kind of deception. Helen was building a support network, 2 other divorced women who understood the challenge of rebuilding identity after betrayal, friends who encouraged her independence, mentors who helped her navigate the practical aspects of managing substantial assets. She was discovering that she didn't need someone else to make financial decisions for her. The most remarkable change was in her relationship with abundance. After years of artificial scarcity, Helen was learning to enjoy the financial security that the divorce settlement provided. She'd bought new clothes, not expensive designer pieces, but quality items that fit well and made her feel confident. She'd renovated Jenny's guest room where she was staying, turning it into a space that reflected her own taste rather than compromise. She's planning a trip to Italy, Jenny told me, the one she always talked about but could never afford. She's not asking anyone's permission. She's not justifying the expense. She's just going because she wants to, and she finally can. Italy, the trip Helen had dreamed about for 20 years, postponed repeatedly because of our supposed financial limitations. Now she was planning it alone, funded by money that had always existed but been hidden from her. The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of us that the woman I'd fallen in love with was still there, but she was stronger now, more self-possessed. Helen was becoming someone who trusted her own judgment, who made decisions based on her own values rather than artificial constraints imposed by others' deceptions. And I was watching this transformation from a distance, proud of her growth but devastated by the knowledge that my lies had made it necessary. The charity foundation documents spread across my desk represent my desperate attempt to find meaning in the money that destroyed my marriage. The Sterling Family Foundation, established with an initial endowment of $50 million, was supposed to be my path to redemption, proof that my intentions had always been noble. I'd chosen causes Helen cared about: education, funding for underprivileged children, scholarship programs for first-generation college students, grants for public school teachers. Part of me hoped she'd see the foundation as evidence that I'd always planned to use the money for good, that my secrecy had been misguided protection rather than selfish hoarding. But Helen's reaction to the foundation was nothing like I'd hoped. Blood money, she called it during our first mediation session. You're trying to buy absolution with money you should never have hidden in the first place. James Mitchell, her attorney, was more direct. Mr. Sterling, this appears to be an attempt to move assets beyond the reach of divorce proceedings and tax authorities. We'll be requesting a full audit of this foundation to ensure it's not simply another vehicle for concealing wealth. They were right, of course. Even my attempts at philanthropy were tainted by the deception that had created the wealth in the first place. I couldn't perform charity with money that had been earned through lies. It would always be an attempt to purchase forgiveness rather than genuine giving. The children's reactions were equally devastating. Sarah had read about the foundation in the local newspaper. My good intentions had become another humiliation for my family. $50 million for education, she said during our last phone conversation. That's great, Dad. Too bad you couldn't spare $8,000 for your own daughter's tuition. David was more analytical, but equally cutting. You're giving away money to help other people's children get educated while your own kids are drowning in student loan debt. Do you see the irony there? I'd tried to explain that I wanted to help them too, that I was working on a way to pay off their loans without making them feel like they were accepting tainted money. But both of them had refused any financial assistance from me, viewing it as another attempt to control the narrative. "We don't want your help," Sarah had said. "We'll pay off our own loans with money we earned honestly." The foundation had attracted media attention too. A local business magazine ran a feature about my sudden philanthropy that raised more questions than it answered. Reporters were connecting dots between the divorce proceedings, the foundation, and the mysterious appearance of substantial wealth. Sources close to the Sterling family suggest the foundation may be related to recently discovered assets in an ongoing divorce case. The article noted, effectively destroying any positive narrative about my charitable intentions. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist I'd started seeing to deal with my guilt and depression, helped me understand that the foundation was another form of control and attempt to manage how my story would be told rather than genuine contrition. "You're still trying to protect your image," she observed during one particularly difficult session. "You want Helen and your children to see you as someone who is always planning to do good with this money, but that's not another form of manipulation." Her words stung because they were true. Even in my attempts at redemption, I was still focused on managing perceptions rather than accepting consequences. The foundation wasn't about helping education, it was about helping my reputation. The real test came when Helen made a counter-proposal through her attorney. Instead of the foundation, she suggested I donate $100 million directly to causes she would choose, with no public recognition for my contributions and no input from me about how the money was used. "If you really want to help," the proposal read, "then help without taking credit. Give anonymously, with no tax benefits, no naming rights, no foundation board positions that let you control the narrative. Just give because it's right, not because it makes you look better." The proposal terrified me. Anonymous giving wouldn't rehabilitate my image or demonstrate my noble intentions. It would just be giving, losing money without gaining anything in return. No reputation boost, and no tax advantages, no public recognition as a philanthropist. But maybe that's exactly what real redemption required: actions taken without expectation of reward, sacrifice made without public acknowledgement, giving that cost me something without benefiting me in any way. Helen's proposal was brilliant and cruel in equal measure. She was offering me a chance to prove that my desire to help was genuine, while simultaneously testing whether I was capable of true selflessness. I stared at the foundation documents for hours. These carefully crafted legal structures designed to preserve my control while demonstrating my generosity. Then I thought about Helen's alternative: messy, uncontrolled, offering no benefits except the possibility of actually helping people. For the first time in 14 years, I had a chance to choose truth over control, genuine action over managed perception. The decision would determine whether I was still the man who'd chosen deception over trust, or whether I might finally become someone worthy of the family I'd lost. Asterisk. The courtroom transcript reads like a confession that's 14 years overdue. Judge Patricia Morrison had seen complex divorce cases before, but nothing quite like ours. A marriage dissolved, not by incompatibility or infidelity, but by the slow poison of systematic deception. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "this court has reviewed the financial discovery in your case. The scope of concealed assets is unprecedented in my experience. Please explain to the court, in your own words, how this situation developed." I stood at the witness stand, acutely aware that every word would become part of the public record, that my confession would be preserved forever in legal documents that anyone could access. Helen sat across the courtroom, flanked by her attorney, her face a mask of composure that couldn't hide the pain underneath. "Your Honor," I began, my voice barely steady, "I started hiding money in 2009 when I received an unexpected windfall from an investment. I told myself it was temporary, that I was protecting my family from the stress and complications of sudden wealth." "How much money are we discussing, Mr. Sterling?" "The first windfall was $4.2 million. Over the following years, through additional investments and compound growth, the concealed assets grew to approximately $547 million. A murmur went through the courtroom gallery. Local reporters scribbled notes, capturing numbers that would be headlines in tomorrow's papers. My family's private nightmare was becoming public spectacle. During this 14-year period, Judge Morrison continued, "Were you aware that your wife was making financial sacrifices based on your misrepresentation of the family's economic situation?" This was the moment I dreaded: the public acknowledgement of how my deception had harmed the people I loved most. Asterisk. "Yes, Your Honor. My wife resigned from a teaching position she loved because she believed we needed to reduce expenses. My children took on substantial student loan debt because they believed we couldn't afford their education. My wife made countless daily sacrifices shopping at thrift stores, clipping coupons, denying herself basic comforts, all based on a financial reality that I knew was false." "Mr. Sterling, what was your wife's reaction when she learned about these concealed assets?" I looked across the courtroom at Helen, remembering that devastating conversation at Riverside Park. She was destroyed, Your Honor. She told me she'd spent years feeling like a failure, like she was the reason our family struggled financially. She'd been proud of how we managed on a modest income, proud of the values she thought we were teaching our children. Learning that it was all based on lies shattered her sense of reality. Judge Morrison turned to Helen's attorney. Mr. Mitchell, please present Mrs. Sterling's testimony. Helen walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she was sworn in. For 23 years, she'd been the private person in our marriage, content to let me handle public interactions. Now she was being forced to expose our most intimate failures to a room full of strangers. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Morrison said, gently, please tell the court how your husband's deception affected your life and your family. Helen's voice was clear but strained. Your Honor, I lived in artificial poverty for 14 years. I made decisions about my career, my children's education, my own basic needs based on financial limitations that didn't exist. I felt guilty about every expense, apologized for every small purchase, sacrificed my own dreams because I thought we couldn't afford them. She paused, gathering strength for the hardest part. The cruelest aspect was that I was happy. Your Honor, I was proud of our simple life, proud of how we made do with little, proud of the values I thought we were instilling in our children. I loved my husband for being a good man who worked hard despite our struggles. Learning that he was secretly wealthy while watching me suffer, it didn't just break my heart. It made me question every memory, every moment of contentment, every sacrifice I'd made willingly. How has this discovery affected your relationship with your children? Our children are angry and confused, Your Honor. They struggle to understand how their father could watch them work multiple jobs to pay for college while he had hundreds of millions of dollars hidden away. They feel betrayed not just by the money, but by every conversation about responsibility and hard work that was based on their father's lies. Judge Morrison studied the documents before her financial statements, psychological evaluations, testimony from family friends who'd witnessed our modest lifestyle while I secretly accumulated more wealth than some small nations. This case presents unique challenges, she said finally. The concealed assets are substantial, but the emotional and psychological damage appears even more significant. This court must consider not only the equitable division of property, but the impact of willful deception on the family unit. The transcript would go on for 127 pages, documenting every financial detail, every emotional revelation, every legal precedent that applied to our unprecedented situation. But the core truth was captured in those first few exchanges of marriage, destroyed not by lack of love, but by an abundance of secrets. Reading that transcript now, I see myself as Helen and the children saw me, not as a protective husband and father, but as someone so afraid of trust that he chose deception over honesty, control over vulnerability, the safety of lies over the risk of truth. The trial was my final confession. The moment when 14 years of secrets became part of the public record, when the man I'd pretended to be was officially replaced by the man I'd actually become. The final divorce decree arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the same mundane efficiency as a utility bill, though it represented the legal end of everything I'd valued most. Judge Morrison's ruling was thorough and unforgiving, a document that would reshape not just our family's future, but set legal precedent for cases involving concealed assets and financial deception. Helen was awarded 60% of all marital assets, including the hidden offshore accounts, a departure from the typical 50-50th split that reflected the court's view of my deception as a form of marital misconduct. The remaining 40% came with conditions that felt more like punishment than settlement: mandatory counseling, supervised financial management, and annual reporting to the court for 5 years. The court finds that Mr. Sterling's systematic concealment of assets over 14 years constitutes financial abuse. Judge Morrison had written, the psychological harm inflicted on Mrs. Sterling and the minor children requires both compensatory and punitive measures. The children's college expenses became my sole responsibility, but with a twist that demonstrated how thoroughly I'd lost their trust. The funds would be managed by an independent trustee, ensuring that my support couldn't be used as leverage for contact or reconciliation. Sarah and David wanted my money to pay for their education, but they didn't want to owe me anything. The IRS settlement consumed another $127 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest. The Offshore voluntary disclosure program had accepted my submission, sparing me criminal prosecution but imposing financial consequences that left me dizzy. 14 years of hidden growth had generated a tax bill that exceeded some corporations' annual revenue. Criminal charges were avoided, but civil penalties felt almost as severe. The court imposed a $50 million fine for willful concealment of marital assets, money that would fund state programs supporting financial abuse victims. Even my punishment was designed to help other families avoid the damage I'd inflicted on my own. My business relationships collapsed faster than I'd anticipated. Word of the divorce settlement spread through professional networks, creating a reputation crisis that destroyed decades of carefully built trust. Clients canceled contracts, investment partners demanded separation, professional associations quietly suggested I step back from leadership roles. Financial deception in personal relationships raises questions about professional integrity. One former colleague explained when ending our business partnership, the message was clear. If I could lie to my wife for 14 years, how could anyone trust me in business? The media attention was relentless and humiliating. The local story had been picked up nationally, turning our family tragedy into a cautionary tale about wealth, secrecy, and marital deception. The $500 million lie became shorthand for my case, a phrase that followed me everywhere. Sarah and David's college experiences were forever changed by their father's notoriety. They faced questions from classmates, professors, and journalists, who wanted inside details about growing up in a family built on such massive deception. Both children changed their social media settings to private and stopped using our family name in public contexts. "We're not your children anymore, in any way that matters," David told me during our last conversation. "You'll pay for our education, because the court ordered it, but that's the extent of our relationship." The house Helen and I had shared for 15 years was sold as part of the asset division. Standing in the empty rooms where we'd raised our children, where we'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, where I'd hidden my laptop with access to accounts worth hundreds of millions, I understood that some things can't be repurchased or restored. Helen used her settlement to buy a smaller house across town, a place with no memories of our marriage, no shadows of my deception. She'd invited Sarah and David for Christmas, but not me. Our children would gather in their mother's new home, while their father spent the holidays alone with the consequences of his choices. The financial monitoring imposed by the court meant that every purchase, every investment, every monetary decision was subject to review. The man who'd hidden $547 million was now required to justify spending $50. My newfound transparency was court-ordered, rather than voluntary accountability forced rather than chosen. Some nights, I calculated what the deception had cost me: Helen's love, my children's respect, my professional reputation, hundreds of millions in settlements and penalties, and the simple peace of living honestly. The price of my secrets had exceeded the value of everything I'd tried to protect, but the true cost wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd destroyed the most precious things in my life, not through malice or greed, but through cowardice, disguised as protection. Helen's new house keys catch the morning light as she hangs them on a hook by the front door, a simple domestic gesture that represents the most profound transformation of her adult life. The 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow is entirely hers, purchased with her own money, decorated according to her own taste, filled with furniture she chose without consulting anyone else's budget or preferences. Jenny sent me photos of the housewarming party. Helen, surrounded by friends and colleagues, genuinely smiling for the first time in months. The woman who'd spent 14 years apologizing for small expenses had created a home that reflected confidence and self-possession. She'd chosen hardwood floors over carpet, granite countertops over laminate, quality over economy, because she's becoming someone I've never seen before. Jenny told me during one of our infrequent conversations, not the woman she was before she married you, but someone entirely new. Stronger, more decisive, less willing to accept limitations imposed by other people. Helen had returned to teaching, but at a private school that appreciated her experience and paid accordingly. No more budget meetings about school supplies, no more choosing between quality education and financial survival. She was teaching because she loved it, not because she needed the modest salary to survive. The Italy trip she'd planned became reality last month. Jenny showed me Helen's photographs standing in front of the Colosseum, sharing wine at a sidewalk cafe in Tuscany, laughing with other travelers at a cooking class in Rome. 20 years of dreaming followed by 3 weeks of actually living the dream, funded by money that had always existed but been hidden from her. "She doesn't talk about you much," Jenny admitted. "When she does, it's not with anger anymore, more like sadness about lost time, about the marriage she thought she had versus the one that actually existed." My own life had contracted to match my diminished circumstances. The modest apartment I'd rented after the house sale felt appropriate for someone learning to live with consequences. Court-supervised financial management meant no luxury purchases, no attempts to recreate the lifestyle my hidden wealth had once made possible. Dr. Williams, my therapist, helped me understand that isolation was both punishment and opportunity, a chance to discover who I was without the security of secrets or the complicated identity of managing multiple lives. "You've never been alone with yourself," she observed. "For 14 years, you've been managing the psychological burden of deception, the stress of maintaining lies, the constant fear of discovery. Now you have to face who you actually are when all that noise is gone." Who I actually was turned out to be someone I barely recognized, smaller than I'd imagined, more frightened, capable of profound selfishness disguised as protection, but also someone capable of growth, of learning from mistakes, of slowly rebuilding integrity from the ground up. The children's healing process was more complicated than Helen's transformation. Sarah had started therapy to work through the betrayal and trust issues my deception had created. David channeled his anger into academic achievement. Determined to succeed without any connection to his father's tainted money. They ask about you sometimes, Jenny reported. Not about reconciliation, but about whether you're learning anything from this. Whether you understand the damage you caused. They were watching from a distance, I realized, trying to determine if their father was capable of genuine change, or if my public contrition was another form of performance. The children I'd raised were now evaluating my character with the critical distance of adults, who'd learned not to trust the people they'd once loved unconditionally. But there were small signs of something that wasn't quite forgiveness but might eventually become understanding. David had mentioned me in a college essay about family resilience. Not as a hero or villain, but as a complicated person whose mistakes had taught him about the importance of honesty. Sarah had kept one family photo in her dorm room, all four of us, from a vacation before the divorce. When our happiness was real, even though its foundation was false. Helen and I had encountered each other twice since the divorce finalized once. At David's college graduation, once at Sarah's academic award ceremony, we'd been polite, careful, maintaining the kind of distance that wounded people preserve when they're still learning to exist in the same world. You look different, Helen had said after Sarah's ceremony, studying my face with curious attention. Smaller somehow, but more real, more real. It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment she could offer acknowledgement that the man she was seeing now was at least genuine, even if he was someone she no longer recognized or trusted. Our former life had been replaced by separate existences that occasionally intersected around our children's milestones. We were no longer partners or lovers or even friends, but we remained parents to two remarkable young people who were learning to love us both despite our failures. It wasn't reconciliation or redemption, but it was honest, truly honest, thing our family had shared in 14 years. The letter to my future self sits sealed in an envelope I'll open in 5 years. On the anniversary of the day Helen served me with divorce papers. Dr. Williams suggested the exercise as a way of documenting my growth, of creating accountability to the man I hope to become, rather than the man I've been. Dear Marcus, it begins. I'm writing this exactly 2 years after our family imploded. On the day our divorce became final. If you're reading this in 2030, I hope you've become someone worthy of Helen's forgiveness, even if reconciliation remains impossible. 2 years of therapy, financial supervision, and enforced honesty have taught me things I was too afraid to learn during 23 years of marriage. The man who hid $500 million from his wife wasn't protecting anyone, he was protecting his own fear of vulnerability, his terror of being known completely, his desperate need to control outcomes, even at the cost of genuine intimacy. Helen has achieved something I never thought possible. She's forgiven me without absolving me. During our last conversation, 6 months ago at Sarah's college graduation, she explained the distinction with the clarity that drew me to her decades ago. I forgive you because carrying anger was poisoning my own happiness, she said. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean trusting. You'll always be the man who chose lies over love for 14 years. That's something I can forgive, but it's not something I can ignore. Her forgiveness was both gift and burden, permission to stop hating myself while maintaining full accountability for the choices that destroyed our marriage. Helen had found peace not through reconciliation, but through acceptance that some damage can't be repaired, only learned from. The children's relationships with me remain fragile but evolving. Sarah calls occasionally, brief conversations that feel like cautious diplomacy between former allies. David sends updates about his graduate school progress. Formal communications that include me in his life without inviting me back into his heart. I don't hate you anymore, Sarah told me during our last phone call, but I don't really know you either. The dad I thought I had doesn't exist, and I'm still figuring out who you actually are. They're both remarkable young people. Sarah, pursuing a master's degree in education policy, David studying environmental law. Their strength and integrity came from Helen's influence, not mine. But I'm grateful they've inherited her resilience, rather than my capacity for deception. The money that destroyed our family has found better purposes through Helen's influence on the settlement terms. The anonymous donations she demanded $100 million, distributed to educational charities with no recognition or tax benefits, taught me what genuine giving feels like. Helping without receiving credit, supporting causes without controlling outcomes, using wealth for service rather than status. My own financial circumstances are permanently changed by court orders that continue for 3 more years. Every expenditure is monitored, every investment decision reviewed, every financial choice made transparent. The man who once managed $500 million in secret now can't buy a car without court approval, but the oversight has become oddly liberating. I sleep better knowing that every dollar I spend is accounted for, that my financial life contains no secrets, that the stress of maintaining deceptions is finally gone. Transparency, even court-mandated transparency, feels lighter than the psychological weight of systematic lies. The business I'm rebuilding focuses on financial counseling for families dealing with sudden wealth lottery winners, inheritance, recipients, entrepreneurs who've sold companies. I help people avoid the mistakes I made, teaching them to include spouses in financial decisions, to prepare children for wealth's responsibilities, to understand that money without trust creates more problems than poverty ever could. The clients trust you because you understand the temptations, my business partner observes. They know you've made the worst possible choices and lived with the consequences. My expertise isn't in managing money, it's in understanding how secrecy destroys families, how good intentions can become selfish choices, how the fear of difficult conversations can create catastrophic problems. I'm uniquely qualified to counsel wealthy families precisely because I've been the cautionary tale other advisors warn clients about. The work provides meaning without redemption, purpose without absolution. I can't undo the damage I caused my own family, but I might prevent other families from experiencing similar destruction. It's service without salvation, useful without being heroic. Some evenings I drive past Helen's house, not to intrude or reconnect, but to see the warm light in her windows, to know that she's built a life that belongs entirely to her. She's learned to trust her own judgment about money, about relationships, about the kind of future she wants to create. The divorce that ended our marriage also freed Helen to become someone she'd never had the chance to be: financially independent, emotionally confident, making choices based on her own values rather than artificial limitations imposed by others' fears. I lost everything that mattered, but Helen gained something invaluable: the knowledge that she could survive betrayal, rebuild, trust in herself, and create happiness that wasn't dependent on anyone else's honesty or deception. If this story has a moral, it's not about money or marriage or the dangers of keeping secrets. It's about the difference between protection and control, between love and fear, between the safety of lies and the risk of truth. I chose fear for 14 years, and it cost me everything. Helen chose courage after discovering my deception, and it gave her a life she'd never imagined possible. The man writing this letter to his future self isn't the same person who hit his first windfall in 2009. That Marcus was driven by anxiety and the desperate need to control outcomes. This Marcus has learned to live with uncertainty, to accept consequences, to choose honesty, even when truth creates discomfort. I hope the man reading this letter in 2030 has continued growing into someone worthy of the family he lost, even if that worthiness comes too late to matter. I hope he's learned that the greatest wealth isn't money hidden in offshore accounts, but trust freely given and honestly maintained. I hope he's finally become the man Helen deserved all along, not because she might take him back, but because integrity is its own reward, and truth is the only foundation on which real love can be built.